Fear. It's the greatest obstacle on the path to success, but once you conquer it, nothing is impossible. The most successful people, the billionaires of the world, aren't fearless. What sets them apart is their courage to face fear and triumph over it. Here I bring you chilling horror stories designed to challenge your mind. Each tale is an opportunity to build your courage, overcome invisible fears, and grow stronger in life. If this is your first time visiting the channel, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Get ready. Our journey into the world of horror begins now. Story 1. Dark Christmas Memories. I'm David Miller, and I once had what many would call a perfect family. Emily, my wife, and our 2 young kids filled our home with warmth and laughter, especially during Christmas. Everything felt like it could last forever. That night, we gathered together to decorate the Christmas tree, exchange gifts, and enjoy a cozy dinner with friends and family. I watched my children and felt a deep sense of gratitude knowing they were growing up in a house filled with love. Those were the moments I thought would never end. As the evening wound down, friends and relatives began to leave, one by one. The house grew quiet again, and we started unwrapping our Christmas presents. Everything felt peaceful. Soft Christmas music played from a small speaker on the table, and the warm glow of the tree lights gave the room a serene, almost timeless quality. Olivia and Ethan, our kids, had already fallen asleep upstairs. Every so often I could hear their soft snores drifting down the hall. Unwrapping the gifts was a ritual of joy. Each one met with smiles, hugs, and words of gratitude. It felt like the perfect ending to a perfect day. But as the pile of presents dwindled, an odd feeling crept over me. There was one box left, a small one wrapped in plain silver paper. It had no tag, no name, no handwriting I recognized. Curious but not suspicious, I figured it might be a gift from an old friend or some secret Santa gesture. But the moment I opened the box, a chill ran down my spine. Inside was a pair of old worn leather shoes. They were unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as memories surged back like a flood. These weren't just any shoes. They were her shoes, my mother's. She had worn these very shoes on Christmas Eve 10 years ago, the night she died. These shoes were the last connection I had to her, the only thing that remained of that tragic night. After her death, they had vanished without a trace. The police searched everywhere but never found them. Over the years, my family had reluctantly come to accept that they were gone, just like she was. And yet, here they were, sitting in my hands looking exactly as I remembered. I stared at them, frozen as if time itself had stopped. My chest tightened and I could feel the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions pressing down on me. How could this be possible? Who sent them? Why now? My mind spiraled back to that Christmas Eve 10 years ago. It was supposed to be a simple night. My mom had left the house to pick up some last-minute gifts but never returned. That night was the beginning of a nightmare I could never fully wake up from. The shoes were the last piece of her I could hold on to, and their disappearance had haunted me ever since. Emily came to my side, her hand gently resting on my shoulder. "David," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. "What's wrong? Who sent these?" I couldn't answer. My hands trembled as I placed the shoes on the table. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. My wife's worried eyes searched my face, but I was too lost in the storm of emotions to offer any comfort. Those shoes, they weren't just a reminder of my mother. They carried the weight of everything unresolved about her death. All the pain, all the questions, all the guilt I had tried to bury over the years came rushing back in a single suffocating wave. The house no longer felt warm or safe. The twinkling lights of the tree seemed distant, cold. I couldn't look away from the shoes as if they held the answers I'd been searching for, even as they unearthed the wounds I had tried so hard to forget. That night, Christmas didn't feel like Christmas anymore. It felt like the past had found me, and I wasn't sure if I could face it. That night, as I lay in bed, the painful memories of 10 years ago came rushing back to me. No matter how hard I tried to bury them, they always lingered, haunting me. I could still vividly remember that Christmas Eve, back when I was just a 10-year-old boy. Only hours earlier, my mother had been laughing and smiling with me, reminding me to behave and wait patiently for the surprise gift she had prepared. I was excited, waiting with anticipation. When she stood up and said she'd be back soon, I didn't question it for a second. But she never came back. I sat by the window staring out into the dark, waiting endlessly, but she didn't return. The cold crept through the house, but all I could think about was how she'd surely walk through the door any moment. She had promised. But by the next morning, my entire world fell apart. I couldn't believe what the police told me. They said my mother had been found in a nearby forest, stripped of her clothes and bearing signs of a frantic struggle. It was as if she had been dragged away before she even had a chance to defend herself. There were no clues, no evidence, no answers. The police found nothing. No fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing to explain what had happened. Every lead disappeared into thin air, and soon after, my mother's case was quietly closed. They called it an unexplained accident, but to me it was no accident. It was a curse. For the past 10 years, I've lived with a pain I couldn't put into words. I grew up, got married, and started a family of my own, but every Christmas Eve, the memories of my mother came back to torment me. She was the one who raised me, who taught me to love, the one person I trusted above all else, and yet she was taken from me in a way that defied all logic. Who killed her? How could they leave so many broken pieces with no explanation? That night, as I stared at those shoes, the feeling of helplessness overwhelmed me once again. It wasn't just the strange appearance of the gift, it was the crushing weight of being trapped in a cycle of unanswered questions. Could these shoes really be the key to the truth? Could they finally lead me to the answers I'd been seeking all these years? A nameless fear crept over me, not just because of the gift, but because of the question that had haunted me for so long. Who killed my mother? At that moment, I decided to call the police. Even though I knew her case had been closed for years, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished, unresolved. The police didn't offer any new information, but I knew that if I didn't act, these questions would haunt me for the rest of my life. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone. The words felt heavy, almost impossible to say out loud. My name is David Miller. I want to reopen my mother's case. I've found new evidence. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. The officer didn't respond immediately, but I knew what I had to do. I had to pursue the truth, no matter how painful it might be. My mother couldn't come back, but I had to find out who took her from me, and why. The pain of her death wasn't just about losing her. It was the silence, the cold indifference from the police, and the way everyone around me seemed to move on. But for me, it was never over. This wasn't the end. When the police closed the investigation with their usual response, "We didn't find anything," I sat silently in the dimly lit room. The soft yellow glow of the lamp fell on the old pair of shoes. They looked lifeless, but to me, they seemed to whisper things I couldn't quite understand. I spent the following days returning to the spot where my mother had disappeared. The snow-covered forest was as quiet as it had been 10 years ago, but now its silence felt heavier. Each step I took on the snow echoed with a crunch, as if someone was walking behind me. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing, just bare branches and the wind howling through the trees. Back home, I became determined to find any clues the police might have overlooked. The shoes still sat there in the middle of the room, almost watching me. Sometimes I swore I could hear faint footsteps. The shoes never moved, but it felt as though they were waiting for something or someone. Every night I sat by the window watching the snow fall. The unanswered question kept looping in my head. Is someone trying to tell me something? Or am I just tormenting myself with memories that have already rotted away? The harder I searched for answers, the deeper I felt myself slipping into an abyss. The shoes became the center of all my thoughts. Some nights I dreamed of my mother walking into the house wearing those shoes. Her face was obscured by shadows. She didn't speak, just stood there silently, but I could feel that she wanted me to understand something. I reached out to experts and private investigators, but it was all in vain. No clues, no progress, no hope. As the final days of the holiday season crept in, I realized how exhausted I'd become. The shoes, the memories, the pain, they all felt like a relentless cycle with no escape. One evening, as the snow began falling heavily again, I stood in front of the cabinet where the shoes were stored. The dim light in the room cast shadows, making the shoes blur into the darkness. I picked them up, and they felt heavier than I remembered. For the first time, I asked myself, are these shoes really a clue, or are they just a vessel for my own obsession? I placed the shoes back in the cabinet, closed the wooden door, and stood there for a long moment. It felt as if I had buried something, but at the same time I had let go of a piece of my pain. Some truths will remain buried forever, and some justice will never be served. But there are also pains that we have to learn to live with, not to find closure, but to find acceptance. I didn't know how much longer the shoes would haunt me, or if I could truly live with these memories. But in the silence of the room, I heard a faint whisper, or maybe it was just the echo of my own mind, telling me it was time to move on. That night, I left the house, leaving the shoes behind in the darkness where they belonged. The snow was still falling, cold and unrelenting, but for the first time I realized I had learned how to endure it. Story: The Gift of the Savior's Shoes and the Horror of Christmas Eve. Laura and I have been best friends since childhood, growing up together in a peaceful small town in Vermont, nestled in the northeastern part of the United States. Vermont is known for its breathtaking autumn foliage and winding country roads, the kind of scenery that fills you with a deep sense of tranquility. Our little village, though small, was our entire world as kids. Summer afternoons were spent climbing the old apple tree in my backyard, laughing and munching on apples fresh off the branches. In winter, we bundled up in thick coats, building snowmen in the front yard and pelting each other with snowballs. Those shared moments tied us together like sisters. As we grew older, life led us in different directions. I moved to a bustling city in the South to pursue a career in media, while Laura chose a university in the Midwest to study art. Over time, the busyness of adulthood made it harder to stay connected, but our bond never wavered. At the beginning of 2023, Laura surprised me by moving to the same city I was living in to start a new job. We were overjoyed to be close again, seeing each other regularly. Without our families nearby, we became each other's support system in this unfamiliar place. That year, we decided not to make the long and inconvenient trip back to Vermont for Christmas. Instead, we planned a cozy celebration at my small apartment. Laura arrived early that morning, wrapped in a pristine white wool coat, her bright smile lighting up the chilly winter day. Together, we cooked the dishes our parents would always make for Christmas, like roasted chicken and apple pie. In the evening, after a video call to wish our families a Merry Christmas, we ventured out into the city to soak up the holiday spirit. The streets were glowing with festive lights, and Christmas trees adorned with ornaments sparkled in shop windows. To commemorate the holiday, we exchanged meaningful gifts, matching pairs of high-heeled shoes, a symbol of our enduring friendship. Those moments, filled with laughter and warmth, felt like the perfect remedy for the homesickness that sometimes lingered in our hearts. After shopping for shoes, Laura and I weren't quite ready to head home. The festive Christmas atmosphere outside was too captivating to leave behind. We decided to take a stroll through the city and made our way to the central square, where a towering Christmas tree stood adorned with thousands of twinkling lights. Christmas music filled the air, blending with the laughter and chatter of families and groups of friends. Laura's face lit up with a radiant smile as she admired the holiday stalls selling handcrafted goods, toys, and seasonal treats. I felt a sense of lightness in my chest, as if all my worries and stresses had momentarily melted away. On our way back to the apartment, we chatted happily, carrying bags full of gifts and snacks. But as we got closer to the neighborhood, the mood began to shift. The lively streets we had walked through earlier were now quiet, with only a few scattered pedestrians passing by. The streetlights were dim and sparse, casting a pale yellow glow that barely pushed back the cold, heavy darkness. Laura pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as our pace slowed. Our apartment building was tucked into a narrow alley, flanked by old weathered houses with shuttered windows. The darkness there felt thicker, almost oppressive, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks, creating an eerie, unsettling noise. "It's so dark," Laura said softly, her voice tinged with unease. I smiled, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry," I said. "Once we're upstairs with the lights on and some wine poured, it'll all feel cozy again." She nodded, but I could see the uneasiness lingering in her eyes. As we reached the base of the staircase leading up to my apartment, I suddenly remembered that I had forgotten to buy a bottle of wine and a few other things for dinner. "You head up first," I told Laura. "I'll stop by the store real quick and be right back." She hesitated briefly, but then nodded, taking the keys from me before heading upstairs. I hurried off to the nearby convenience store, not thinking much about it. Meanwhile, Laura climbed the stairs slowly. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the room was eerily dark. She reached out for the light switch but froze as she sensed a shadowy figure looming in front of her. In the faint glow from the hallway, she saw a thin man with piercing eyes staring directly at her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively stepped back, trying to scream, but no sound came out. The man lunged at her, moving with terrifying speed. He grabbed her by the neck, his grip like iron, and began shouting in a wild, guttural voice, "Why did you leave me? Why?" Laura struggled desperately, clawing at his hands, but he was too strong. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as the world around her began to fade. Back at the store, I was suddenly overcome with a wave of unease. I couldn't explain it, but my heart started racing, and a sense of dread washed over me. Something felt wrong. I quickly paid for my items and rushed back to the apartment. As I approached the staircase, I heard strange noises coming from upstairs. It sounded like objects crashing to the floor, mixed with muffled sounds that could have been cries for help. A surge of panic shot through me as I sprinted up the stairs. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar, and the room inside was completely dark. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. Laura was lying on the floor, pinned down by a thin man who was gripping her neck with both hands. His face was twisted in rage as he muttered incoherent words. Laura's movements had slowed, her breath shallow, and her eyes were squeezed shut as if she were about to pass out. Without thinking, I rushed forward, gripping one of the high-heeled shoes still in my hand. Driven by pure instinct, I swung it repeatedly at the man, hitting him hard enough to make him loosen his grip. I didn't even know where I was striking him. I just kept hitting until he stumbled back and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I dropped the shoe and knelt down to help Laura, who was coughing and trembling uncontrollably. I held her tightly, both of us shaking as the realization of what had just happened began to sink in. When I flipped the light switch, the room flooded with light, revealing the face of the man lying unconscious on the floor. My heart sank as I realized it was Mark, my ex-boyfriend. Memories came rushing back like a tidal wave, leaving me dizzy. Mark was someone I had once loved deeply, but our relationship ended bitterly. Back then, he was a heavy drinker, often losing control and emotionally abusing me. After enduring it for too long, I finally broke up with him and cut off all contact. I never imagined that after all these years he would show up in my life like this. Laura sat trembling against the wall, her hands clutching her neck. Her face was pale and her eyes were still filled with terror. I crouched down to check on Mark and found that he was still breathing, though unconscious. It seemed the blow from my high heel was strong enough to knock him out but not seriously injure him. Without hesitation, I called 911. While we waited for the police to arrive, I tried to comfort Laura, but I couldn't stop shaking either. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every minute felt like an hour. When the police arrived, they quickly took control of the situation. Mark was handcuffed and taken away. One of the officers informed me that he had broken into the apartment using an old key, a key I had completely forgotten I'd once given him back when we were dating. The thought that Mark had held on to it all these years, only to use it on a night like this, sent shivers down my spine. After the police left, Laura and I sat in silence in the tiny apartment. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew this Christmas Eve would forever remain a haunting memory. My eyes drifted to the high heel lying on the floor, its shiny surface catching the light from the lamp. What had once been a small gift symbolizing joy and connection between Laura and me had now become a tool that saved our lives. I silently thanked my instincts and the stroke of luck that had guided me in that critical moment. In the days that followed, Laura and I tried to return to normal life, but it wasn't easy to move past what had happened. Laura started having nightmares and would often wake up in the middle of the night, shaken. I too couldn't shake the feeling of unease whenever I was home alone. We spent a lot of time talking, supporting each other as we worked through the lingering fear. Laura even suggested I take a self-defense class to better protect myself in the future. I agreed, realizing how quickly life could spiral out of control with just one moment of carelessness. That high heel, something so ordinary and seemingly insignificant, now carried a much deeper meaning. It wasn't just a reminder of a terrifying Christmas. It had become a symbol of the inner strength we all possess when faced with danger. Life is unpredictable, filled with both good and bad surprises, but what truly matters is how we confront and overcome them. Whenever I look back on that night, I still get chills, but I also feel a profound sense of gratitude, grateful that Laura was with me, grateful that we survived, and grateful that we faced our fears together. It was a hard lesson, but one I know I will never forget.